We're on Daf Ayin Ches Amud Aleph, and we're up to the Sugya Rabbi Yossi. And you'll find the Gemara of Nema Masnisin Delo Kirab Yossi on the second line from the top of Ayin Ches Amud Aleph. My sense is that in order to appreciate this next sugya, which is quite challenging, we go back to the Mishnah itself and read the Mishnah piece by piece. So we're going back now for a moment, a long moment, to Daf Ayin Vav Amud Beis. And you'll see on the bottom of Daf Ayin Vav Amud Beis the Mishnah. And until now, we've been learning sort of piecemeal the Gemara related to each part of the Mishnah, but I'd like to go through the Mishnah piece by piece. And then, B'li Neder, we'll start the sugya of Nema Masnisin Delo Kirab Yossi on Daf Ayin Ches Amud Aleph. So, without further ado, the Mishnah says Chamisha Dvarim Boim B'Tumah, and that's the koteret of this Mishnah. We're talking about 5 karbonos tzibur. In truth, there are more than 5, as the Gemara is going to point out. That if we have tumah, and we mentioned various possibilities, let's say rov kahal tmeim, or rov kohanim tmeim, or the klishares are tmeim. In all these cases, we have 5 categories of karbonos, which are karbonos tzibur, and they are brought b'tumah. And what that means is that the avodas hakarban and the haktaras haimurim are done b'tumah. Because how do I know that we're talking about everything but the achilas habailim or hakohanim? Because immediately the Mishnah says v'ein necholim b'tumah. So from that phrase v'ein necholim b'tumah, I shed a light on the first part of the Mishnah called ba'im b'tumah. And ba'im b'tumah means that the avodas hakarban and even the haktaras haimurim is done b'tumah. The only reservation here, limitation, is einom necholim b'tumah. Everything else is done b'tumah. From the fact that it says einom necholim b'tumah, it means that everything else was done b'tumah. And that includes both the hakrava, all the avodos, and the haktaras haimurim. All this is done b'tumah. Now, there's going to be a sugya of Rav Chizda that we should mention at this point, and Rav Chizda seems to be of the opinion that the haktarah is not dochet tumah. In other words, the haktarah itself is not done b'tumah. However, it could be that Rav Chizda is talking about a very specific case where the tumah was contracted after the zrikas hadam. And that's different than a case of a carbon where there was tumah even before the zrikas hadam. Which would mean that Rav Chizda, when we get to that sugya, Rav Chizda Mitzvah will say that if the tumah took place before the zrika, then even Rav Chizda will agree that this zrika is a zrika on tumah and sets up the haktaras haimurim on the mizbeach tumah. Rav Chizda's point is that if at the time of the zrika the carbon was tar and subsequent to the zrika became tameh, then that tumah blocks the possibility of haktaras haimurim. All right, again, this is all very futuristic. But let's go through the 5 cases that are listed in the Mishnah. And my goal here is honestly just to get the basics, because sometimes, mirov, that there's so many variables and so many categories that are being thrown at you, you sometimes need a chazara on the basics. Okay. Now, the Mishnah says, the enam necholim bituma. Now, if you take a look for a moment at Rashi, Dibra Maschil Chamisha Dvarm, that's the second of the wide lines. Rashi says, Ein lecha karban nechal ela elu. The karban sibur doches hatuma. The Ashmeina Masnisa, the Afagav, the Karav bituma, La Fuke Tzibur Yedei Chovasam, Einam Necholim Bituma. So Rashi tells us that the Tana of our Mishnah is notifying us or teaching us that even though in Tara, if these karbanos would have been bitara, they are necholim. Nevertheless, that since they're being brought bituma, that hakrava bituma is not for the purpose of achila. It doesn't culminate in achila. These karbanos bitara would ultimately culminate in achila, Rashi says. But here, there's no achila because it's tameh. So it's ba'im bituma, but enam nechalim bituma. And that means that the whole purpose of the havah here is to be yote yedei chovasam, that the tzibur should now fulfill their obligation. So when the Torah is matir the havah bituma, it's not matir the achila bituma. We would think that once the Torah was matir the akrava bituma, then ipso facto, the hakrava culminates with achila, and that achila also would be permitted bituma. No. But now we get to the exception. And the exception is going to be Pesach. Why? Because in Pesach, the hakrava is not, shall I say, meaningful unto itself as an end unto itself, but rather it culminates in the achila. Now again, every carbon, bitara, culminates in achila, but that word culminates is very confusing because culminates means that that's the last stage. But when we say in Pesach culminates in achila, what we're saying is, as the Mishnah formulates it here at the end of this Mishnah, lo ba mitchilaso ela lachila, that the ikar carbon is the achila. Normally, the ikar carbon is to be yotze in the midst of akrava. Achila is a spin-off. It's in a sense, a secondary element that results from the akrava, but the akrava is meaningful unto itself. In the case of Karban Pesach, however, the purpose of the akrava is to culminate, to lead to the achil. And therefore, for sure, when the Torah was matir akrava in Pesach, then ipso facto was matir achil as well. Now again, when we say einam nechalim b'tumah, that means the following: Bein im abosar atzmo nitma al yidei hakohanim atmeim chakrivu. Right, in the case where the kohanim atmeim, the basar itself now contracts tumah because the kohanim are dealing with the basar; they have hands on the basar. But what happens in a case where the basar was not nitma? And it seems that because the kohanim are tmeim, even if the basar would be tar, again, we're going to have to orchestrate how that happens, but the kohanim would still be enjoined from eating the basar because a tummy is not allowed to eat basar kodesh. So when we say einam nechalim b'tumah, it's irrelevant as to whether or not the basar became tummy, because even if the basar remained tar, the kohanim, insofar as they are tmeim, cannot eat the basar. Now, in the note, he says that one of the Rishonim, again, I'm just mentioning it to put it on the table. The Rivan says that if the Kohanim are Tmeim and they were Makriv the carbon and they somehow did not come in direct contact with the basar remained tar, then Nechal HaBasar, but not to the Kohanim Tmeim, but to Tahor. So we'll find a Kohen Tar and he could eat the basar. Or in the case of Shlomim, we'll find someone amongst the Miut who did not contract Tumah and he'll eat the basar. Okay. Now, there's one carbon that's brought by the tzibur that is not brought bitumah, and that's the carbon chagiga. So, believe me, the very next Mishnah we're going to have. No. I'm sorry. The Mishnah is actually in an earlier parak, the Mishnah of chagiga. All right. Now let's go through it one by one. The first on the list is the Omer. Now this is a carbon mincha that's brought on the 16th of Nisan, and the purpose of this carbon Omer, of Minchas Omer, is to be matir all the chadash. Now what is brought in the Omer? It's Isaron Soles Misiorim, and it's from the chadash. So from the newly reaped barley of this year's harvest, they created a soles, a very fine barley flour, and they took an isaron. Keep in mind that there are various conditions. For example, the saorim have to be grown in Eretz Yisrael. They can't come from Chutz La'aretz. Then they do what's called blila. Blila means when you take a log of shemen and you add the fine flour to the shemen and you mix it all together. And on top of this mixture of an isaron soles and a log shemen, there was also what's called a lavona. And the Kohen had to do a kmitza on lavona. Again, I don't know the English translation. I think it's called frankincense. I don't know. You'll look it up. And this kometz was now added to the mixture, the blila of the saron soles of siorin and lug shem. Then they did something called tnufa, okay, where they waved the mincha, and then they were ready for haktarah. How much of this concoction was actually burnt on the mizbeach? That's called a kometz. Every mincha has haktaras hakometz, and in that sense, Minchas Omer is no exception. Now, what happens to the balance of this mincha above and beyond the kometz that is burnt on the mizbeach? Hashar, which is called shirayim, nechal lekohanim, and that's true again for any mincha, that is the kometz faktor on the mizbeach, and the shirayim anechalim lekohanim. Now, after the omer is brought, you're allowed to now cut down all of the new crop of grains, and it's all yasher. The Rambam dedicates an entire chapter to this Minchas HaOmer and the repercussions, the result of the Minchas HaOmer in Hilchas Tvidim Musaf and Perek Zayin. Now, Minchas HaOmer is brought to Tumah, but the Shirayim cannot be eaten b'Tumah, because as opposed to the Korban Pesach, we cannot say that the Ikar Minchas HaOmer is L'Shem Achila. but rather the Omer is brought to be matir the Chadash and Einom Nechol B'Tum. Now we go on to Shtei Alechem. Shtei Alechem is also a Korban Mincha, and it's brought on Chag HaShavuos. And again, the purpose is not to eat the Shtei Alechem, but rather to be matir Chadash in the Migdash, on the Mizbeach, that now any mincha subsequent to the Shtei Alechem can be brought from the new grains of this year's crop. Now, when did they actually prepare the Shtei Alechem? This was on Erev Chag HaShavuos. They took 2 esronim. That's again twice the amount that they did for the Minchas Omer, because here we need Shtei Alechem. And what's important to understand is that the solus is not like the Omer, a solus of Siorim, but rather solus of Chitin, of wheat, from the Tuach Hadasha, again from Eretz Yisrael. They baked 2 chalos, and on Shavuos itself, they did a tnufa of the Shtei Alechem together with the kvasim. How many kvasim were there? 2 kvasim. So the Shnei kvasim and Shtei chalos. Now, the kvasim had the status of a korban olah, if I'm not mistaken. I'll double check that. And the emurim are burnt on the mizbeach. I don't know, my mistake. It's not an olah, because an olah is kula kolim. That's my mistake. Now, the emurim of the shtei kvasim are burnt on the mizbeach, and the balance of the basar is eaten by the kohen. One of the 2 of the Shtei Alechem is given to the Kohen Gadol. The second is divided up a bit amongst the Mishmeres of Kohen. Now the Mishnah is going to tell us that Boim B'Tumah, with regard to the Shtei Alechem, it means the Tnufa is done even B'Tumah, and there's no other avoda in Shtei Alechem other than Tnufa. Very important. There's no komets. So basically, the Shtei Alechem is eaten as is after the Tnufa with the Shtei Kvasim. The Shtei Kvasim, they already have the status of another korban, which is divided basar, emurim for the Mizbeach, and the rest for the Kohanim. And this mincha called Shtei Alechem can be brought b'tumah, but the lechamim, the Shtei Alechem, cannot be eaten b'tumah. So the Kohen Gadol could not eat his half, his lechem, and the Anshe Mishmeres could not eat them, assuming they're tmeim. Because as opposed to the Pesach, which is ikra l'shem achila, here it's ein ikra l'shem achila, but rather to be matir and machshir all the menachas henceforth from Tvuah Chadash. Then we get to Lechem Aponim. Lechem Aponim means 6 and 6, 12 challahs. And each one of them was made of Shnei Esronim Kemach. So before we spoke about Isaron of Soles for the Omer and Shnei Esronim for the Shtei Alechem. Now we're talking about Shnei Esronim for each one of the 12, what do they call it in English? Showbreads, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, Shtei Alechem, of the Lechem Aponim. Now, what day of the week do they organize it on the Shulchan? In 2 sections of 6 Lechem, that's on Shabbos. And then they take 2 spoons, which are called Mazichim, and each one of these 2 spoons has a komets of Levona, and these are placed in between the 2 rows of Shtei Alechem. Now, the following Shabbos, they brought a new, fresh baked set of 12 lechamim, and beziche levona, they took the chalos, the old chalos, and immediately replaced them with the new chalos. They took the baziche levona and immediately replaced them with a new 2 baziche levona. They were maktir the 2 bazichim of levona, and the chalos were given half to the Kohen Gadol and half to the Anshe Mishmeres of Kohen. Once again, as opposed to Pesach, which is Eino Ba Lachila, the Lechem Apanim is Lo Ba Iko Lachila. And that's a Chiddush. You would have said that what's the purpose to Shtei Lechem if not the Achila? Kohen Gadol gets his and the rest of the Kohen get his. No. Lahamid Shulchan Lekavod Ulehidu. Unbelievable. The purpose and the kiyum of the Shtei Lechem is in the Shulchan itself. It's a kiyum in Shulchan. So lo yamid, lo yamod ha-shulchan lo lechem. Sharei omed al shulchan, the lechem is sitting on the table. Shivas yamim, hu roi lachila, and it's not nechal. For 7 days, the lechem is sitting on the shulchan, it's not nechal. So it's really the siluk of the lechem that engenders the achila, but not the lechem itself. The lechem itself is there for the purpose of the shulchan. And the nafkamina is going to be that it's eino nechal bitum. Next online. Zivchei shalmei tzibur. Now, shalmei tzibur is what we referred to before. This, it's almost a contradiction in terms. Shalmei tzibur. Korban tzibur is never a shlomim. But the exception is the 2 kvasim that we said accompany the Shtei Lechem on Chag HaShavuos. So only on Chag HaShavuos do we have Shalmei Tzibur, the Shnei kvasim, which are shlovim, as we said before, that are brought together on Shavuos with the Shtei Lechem. Fine. And again, like any korban shlomim, half of the korban the murim go to the mizbeach, and the balance are eaten by either zichrei kuna or the bailim. In a classic shlomim, in the case of shnei kivtzei atzeres, the balance is eaten by kohen. And once again, ein ikron l'shem achila, but rather the shnei kivtzei atzeres are brought as an accompaniment to the Shtei Lechem. Next, Seirei Roshei Chadashim. So these are the goats, the Seirei Izim, that are brought on Rosh Chodesh. The pasuk says in Parshas Pinchas, it says, "Ubrashei Chodshechem takrivu Seir Izim echad lechatos." And there's Haktaras Murim, and the basar is nechal lekon. Once again, the purpose of this korban is not for the achilas habasar, but rather lechaper al tumas migdosh v'kadoshav. Okay, that's the first sugi of Masechet Shavuos. Therefore, in all these cases, it's boim b'tuma veino nechal b'tuma. Aber Pesach is bo b'tuma v'nechal b'tuma. Now, here I want to ask you a question. How much of the korban Pesach is going to be nechal b'tuma? Is it the entire korban Pesach? So he quotes here the Sfas Emes, Shelo huto lechol el kizayis shushir achila v'lo yoser. Now, wait a second. We have a problem here. Let's assume you've got a group of 10 people that participate in this chabur of the korban Pesach, and they're tmeim, but it's bar b'tum and nechal b'tum. But now the Sfas Emes is saying you can only eat per person 1 kizayis. He's holding dechuya, not hutra. But you have to be careful that the basar should not be nosa. There's a special law of nosa. So in such a case of a Pesach haba b'tumah, according to Sfas Emes, the chaburas were very large chaburas, unusually large, to guarantee that if we divvy up the Pesach one kazais per person, nevertheless the entire Pesach will be consumed and there will be no violation of nos. Okay, shaloba mitchilaso el lachila. So here we have to quote a pasuk in Parshas Bo. Ish lefi achlo tachosu alaseh. Lefi achlo. The Torah is telling you that this carbon is for achlo, it's for achila. And even though this pasuk is referring to the minui of the chabura on the Pesach, but it's telling you that you can only be part of this carbon Pesach if you're lefi achlo, you're roy lachila, to the exclusion of a zaken or a chole who's not capable of achila, he cannot participate in the carbon Pesach. He's eno roy lechom mimene kazayis. Now again, let's just reiterate what we said as a summary. Shara karbanos, all the other karbanos Tzibur mentioned here. Ein ikar hakarvasam litzarch achila el litzarch davar acher. And he quotes here Rav Moshe Feinstein, Sheyesh chiluk af betachlis avodas hakarban, shavodos shara karbanos ikran hila mitzvah, and therefore nita al yodam abasar beachila the haimurim likarv al mizbech mashenke bepesach kol avodosov hein rak kidei lahachshir es hapesach lachila v'yein lehem chashivus avoda mitzad atzm. Okay, now we're ready for our sugya for today. Nema masnisen on the top of Hein Ches, the lo Rav Yossi. Okay, now our Mishnah says that a carbon that has a set period of time and it's a carbon tzibur, it's ba b'tumah. That's against Rav Yossi. The Sanya we learned in the Brisa, Rabbi Eliezer Omer atzitz meratza al achilos. Rabbi Yossi Omer ein atzitz meratza al achilos. Now, if we assume that im ein basar ein dam, then we have a real problem here with our Mishnah. Why? Because Rabbi Yossi holds that ein atzitz meratza al achilos. The tzitz doesn't have the power to take a basar tameh and make it into keilu a basar tam. So the basar remains tameh. There's going to be no achila of the basar, and if there's no achila of the basar, then there's no zrikas hadam. We can't bring this carbon. Mishlema, according to Rabbi Eliezer, who holds atzitz meratz al achilos, so that part of the carbon that's nechali adam, even though it's tameh, we're going to say that the tzitz is meratza, and it's as if it's tar. But Rabbi Yossi says, "Ein atzitz meratza al achilos." We're talking about achilas adam. So you could have a krova al gabi mizbeach of the murim, and on that there'll be ritzit tzitz, so that even though the murim atmeim, we could be makriv them on the mizbeach, but not so with regard to achilas adam. Ein tzitz meratza al anechol. Kasal kedaitach, right now the Gemara is holding Midikav Rabbi Yossi ein atzitz meratza al achilos. Ki Rabbi Yeshua svirale. We assume that we can identify Rabbi Yossi's ruling with that of Rabbi Yeshua. The Omar Rabbi Yeshua holds the inon tarte, that in order for a carbon to be kosher, we need that the basar and the dam would both be roy. Right? That the basar is roy lachil and the dam is roy lachtar al gabi mizbeach. Because again, if if the brisa is recording Rabbi Yossi that Einat Tzitz Maratz al Achilos, my nafkamina. I mean, who cares? Lieza inyan yesh chiluk at Tzitz Maratza al Necholim olo. I mean, what's the nafkamina? The answer is the nafkamina is because Rabbi Yossi holds like Rabbi Yeshua that im ein basar ein dam, so that torpedoes the whole enterprise of Akrovas Akarban if the dam cannot be subjected to zrika because the basar is not subjected to achila because einat tzitz maratz ala necholin. The Gemara says, Nema hashta masnisin below Rav Yosef. The bottom line is that when the Mishnah has a list of 5 karbanos that are brought betuma, if Rabbi Yossi holds einat tzitz maratz ala ochlim, you don't have basa that's royal achila. How can you be zorik to now? It cannot be reconciled with Rabbi Yossi. And now the Gemara is going to reinterpret Rabbi Yossi. Lo, the Mishnah could be reconciled with Rabbi Yossi. You'll ask me, how is it possible to be zorik the dam if the tzitz is not maratz on the necholim? The answer is Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Elazar Sfirulei the Omar dam afal pishein bas. Even though einat tzitz maratza, and therefore the bas is not royal achila, but nevertheless there will be zrikas adam because we should identify Rabbi Yossi with the shita Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Eliezer holds. Well, let's say what against Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua holds im ein bas or ein dam, and Rabbi Eliezer holds. And you remember the drasha that he had from the pasuk to teach us that zrikas adam is independent, and forget about the basar. Basar is lost; it's tamei. Whatever happens to the basar, the zrika is still in place and valid. So at this point, instead of combining 2 principles together, number 1, im ein basar ein dam, and number 2, einat tzitz maratz al necholim, which would completely exclude if you made that connection in Rabbi Yossi's frame of reference, exclude Rabbi Yossi from our Mishnah, we're going to say that Rabbi Yossi, although he holds that einat tzitz maratz al necholim, and the basar therefore is not royal achila b'tuma, but nevertheless the dam stands on its own because Rabbi Yossi holds like Rabbi Eliezer against Rabbi Yeshua, and according to Rabbi Yossi, yesh dam below basar. Ihachi. If that be the case, that Rabbi Yossi agrees to Rabbi Eliezer's position, and therefore you could have dam without basar, is lamai hilchasa einat tzitz maratz al achilos. What is the, again, who cares about whether the tzitz is maratz al achilos or not? If the dam stands on its own, independent of the achilos, so flip a coin whether or not the tzitz is maratz al achilos or not. So now the Gemara is bothered by Rabbi Yossi. But forget about Rabbi Yossi. I don't get it. Rabbi Eliezer himself says that the tzitz is maratz. My nafkamina. I mean, Rabbi Eliezer holds that yesh down below basar. So why does he have to introduce the ritzui tzitz? Who needs ritzui tzitz? I'll grant you that the basar is not royal achila. So what? Im ein bas afal pishein basar yesh down. The way you're asking the question, that if we're going to be zorik the dam without the basar, even if the basar is not roy, so then there's no difference whether the tzitz is maratza or not maratza, is ask me a better question. According to Rabbi Eliezer, who disagrees with Rabbi Yossi, and he holds the Omer tzitz maratza, of what significance is tzitz maratza? Is came on the Omar dam afal pishein basar? Is tzitz maratza achilus my hilchasa? What did is now generated by the fact that tzitz is meratz al achilos. Vis-a-vis what din was this halacha of tzitz meratz al achilos formulated? Because even if there was no tzitz meratz and there was no basa that's royal achila, we have the dam, and we can be zorik the dam. Okay, so now we're at a crossroads. We're going to introduce two major branches of kodshim at this particular crossroads. One is called pigul, and the other is called me'ila. Neither of them are too good. You don't want to violate either of them. I mean, if you eat basa that's pigul, goodbye, Charlie, you chayv karetz. That's not a good thing. All right. Now, the paradox of pigul, PP, paradox of pigul, is that pigul, when it applies, has to have a monopoly. What do I mean? No other psul could be active if you want to get pigul, so to speak. Pigul means that there was no other psul other than pigul. That's paradoxical. I mean, you would say, Adarabba, add on one psul after the other. Who cares? At the end, you have the psul of pigul. No. It doesn't work that way. Everything fits into place. There's nothing possible except for machshavas pigul, which is machshava during one of the avodos of chutz l'zman. So when he does the, let's say, for example, the Kabbalah Saddam or the Alocha Saddam, the Zrika Saddam, he has in mind that we're going to eat this carbon tomorrow or 2 days from now in the case of Shalom. It's chutz l'zman. And as a result of machshavas pigul, the carbon now, the basar carbon becomes aser be'isur karetz. Now, if your interest is against pigul, you're in the movement against pigul. That's your flag, your black flag, right? I'm against pigul. You don't want pigul. Then what position do you want to take on whether the tzitz is maratza or eino maratza? You want the tzitz not to be maratza. Because if the tzitz is not maratza, then you have another psul here, an additional psul in the basar. And once you have an additional psul, that undermines pigul. So you begin to see where the Gemara is taking us now. We thought that the whole issue of whether tzitz is maratza in the case of tumah, if the basar is considered tamei because einat tzitz maratza, if it's considered like tar because tzitz maratza, we thought the whole nafkamina was about the carbon itself, meaning the zrika of the dam. Because if you hold ein dam, if ein basar, ein dam, etc. So can the dam be valid if there's no tzitz to be maratza, the tumas basar? No. That's not what we're dealing with. We're holding now Bein Rabbi Eliezer, Bein Rabbi Yossi, that afal pishein basar yesh dam. So why are we interested in ritzui tzitz? The answer is to determine whether we could be kovea pigul or not. Ella, says the Gemara, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yossi are arguing about tzitz, whether it's maratza achilos, not as far as the carbon is concerned, whether you could be zorik the carbon or not, because we're holding now the yesh down below basa, but rather lemikveh lepigul. The Kohen has a machshava during one of the avodos that the carbon should be eaten liachar zman. He gives another example. Just 1 second. If Yachshov HaKohen B'Lochas Adam is because Asus Achas and Uz Gavinach. He says that you can have the classic pigul is when he has a machshava to eat the basar after the allotted time. But he says you could also have a machshava that the avoda will be done liachar zmano. Like, for example, let's say during the Holochas Adam, he has in mind that the zrik will take place after sunset. That's also machshava's pigul. And the din of pigul is that if you eat the basar of pigul, you chayv karetz. Oh. Now, let me just read you this note. It says, Dina pigul hu, she'im b'shah achas me arba avodas hakorban shchita kabbalah holochas rika, chashav lizrok es adam o lahaktis hakorban o lechol mimenu liachar zman haroilo, machshava zu, hi machshavas pigul, uposeles es hakorban, ve'ochel mibsar hakorban chayav karetz. And this, he says, is derived in Vayikra, Perek Zayin. It says, "V'yim he'ochel yochel pigul yeh v'nefesh ochels v'menu avona tisa." Fine. Now listen to this. Kol karban shenifsal machmas ezetam. If there's another reason to passel the karban, lo chalalov pigul im yachshov machsheves chutz zmana. Why? Shenemar bepigul lo yerotze. In a karban that's kosher, it says yerotze, and in pigul lo yerotze. And this is all in Vayikra Perek Zayin. And the Gemara Menachos darshans the following: Kishar tzoas kosher, kachar tzoas posel. She'ena karbanasa pigul ela biofen shebelo yisur pigul haya karban kosher. In other words, pigul is in a sense the same thing as a karban kosher, but it became pigul because of pigul. The machsheves pigul took a karban that otherwise would have been kosher and made it into pigul. So it's interesting. Let's say the Kohen had a machsheves pigul early in the avoda. Let's say during the Kabbalah or the Holoch. It's not going to be pigul unless he completes all the avodos bekashrus. If, let's say, he drops, or let's say at some point he picks up an extra beged, and he's puzzled within yitur begadim, or he uses his left hand for the zrika instead of his right hand, or he becomes tummy, whatever it might be. If now the other avodos are not behechsher, then his machsheves pigul does not generate pigul. Why? Because the Torah is saying lo yerotze and yerotze. It's lo yerotze, but it would have been yerotze. Now the Gemara goes on to Me'ilah. What's Me'ilah? Me'ilah is an Isur hanenem in a hegdesh b'shogeg harei mo behegdesh v'chayev lahashiv hegdesh keren v'chomesh maybe karban asham. And this is in Vayikra Hey nefesh ki simol mal v'chata'a b'shgaga mikadche Hashem v'hevias Hashamol Hashem v'esa shachata min hakodesh yishalim v'eschamisha so Yosef Ola. So you have a behemoth that was hugdash lekarban, it's Kodshei Hashem, and you benefit from it. A shava prutas worth of anah. You violate an isa me'ilah because the Torah says nefesh ki simol mal b'Hashem. Now, anene mea korban konim zrika over be'isur me'ila and all the repercussions. But misha nidrak damo al mizbech oka mimenu isur me'ila bezrikas hadam matira es habasar lachila likon the enam mikroim od kodshe Hashem. So it's really fascinating because we would like to believe that when you are maktir the basar after the zrika, or you eat the basar in the case of kohanim, etc., that also is part of the kiyum karma. But we're saying it's not called Kachi Hashem, like in Bailus, so to speak. I mean, to use that term very loosely, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives up his Bailus on the carbon with the zrika. And Be'ila means stealing from Kachi Hashem. Now, again, I don't believe for one moment this has to do with the fact that Zrika is Matir Hakar Murim. That's still Kachi Hashem. But the Zrika is going to set up a chain reaction which will ultimately be Matir the Basal Achilas Adam. So therefore, the Zrika inherently is going to remove the Basar from the state of Lashem, and it's now no longer Lashem. And now the Gemara says that Eina Bosa Yotzim Midei Me'ila Bizrika Sadam Ella Kishabasar Hutar. You want to remove the Isser Me'ila on the Basar as a result of Zrika Sadam? No, that can only work if the Zrika is culminated by Basar Tar. Then the Zrika does what it has to do, and it removes the Isser Me'ila. It's no longer Kachi Hashem. So Zrika Sadam, Matira is a Matir because now the Basar can be eaten by the Kohen, and it's no longer Kachi Hashem. Now we get to the case of the Basar that contracted Tumah. It's Eino Nita L'Kohen B'Achila B'Zrika Sadam. And therefore it's Eino Yotze Midei Me'il. So let's just summarize. The issue of whether or not the tzitz is maratza on their cholim when the basar is tameh is going to have an impact in two different directions, two opposing directions on pigul and me'ila. In the case of pigul, it's going to suspend the chalos iser kares of pigul if the tzitz is eno maratza ala basar. If the tzitz is not maratza ala basar, no, just the opposite. Sorry. If the tzitz is maratza ala basar, that's going to generate pigul, because then all the dimensions of the carbon are behechshe. And there's no psul at all, because the tzitz is maratza ala basar. So once again, the ritzui tzitz is now a chumrah, correct? Why? Because now pigul will be chal. Now let's see in me'ila. If there's ritzui tzitz, so now in me'ila the ritzui tzitz is a kula, because as a result of the ritzui tzitz, the Zrika Sadam is going to be Matu Lisa Me'ila. Because the the power inherent in this Rika to remove Me'ila is because it's Mati the boss. And if you hold Ritzi Tzitz, then you have a Heter boss. So let's see if we understand the Gemara now. Rabbi Eliezer saw Maratz Tzitz Iluye. The Tzitz is Maratz on Basar of the carbon, even the Basar that's Nechal Yodam. Umashvile Kitar, that's the magic of the Tzitz. It makes Basar Tome into Kaviyachal Basar Tar. Now, if that be the case, then we have a Chumrah in Pigel because it's now no longer possible. The Kavalei Pigel. So now the Machshavas HaKohen of Chutzes Mano or the Avodah should be Chutzes Mano, all that is going to generate Pigel because there's no other psul here. And therefore, if you eat from this meat, your Chayiv Koreh says Pigel. Okay, now we talk about Me'ila. Umapikle Mide Me'ila. This is the Kula, as we said before. The tzitz is maratza lechumra with regard to pigul by removing the psul of the basar. Now pigul will be generated with an isa kares. In the case of me'ila, it's lekula because now this dam, if you hold tzitz maratza, has the power to remove me'ila, to be mafkia the shem kodshei Hashem, because now the zrika was mati the basar and we're holding ritzui tzitz. Rabbi Yossi saw v'lo maratza tzitziluye, v'lo mashvile ketar, v'lo kavalei bepigul. That's the good news. The kula would be now in Rabbi Yossi because the tzitz is not maratza. There's another psul in the basa. But it's also a chumrah with regard to me'ila v'lo mapikle midei me'ila. And this rika now would not have the power to remove the shem kodshei Hashem because einat tzitz maratza, and therefore the dam is not being mat to the boss. He summarizes this in the following. He says, "The kaven is bayer sheyesh chiluk, but mesha einat tzitz maratza al achilos legabe pigul u'meila ein hechrech sheRabbi Yossi sover keRabbi Yeshua shemein basar ein dam." He could hold like Rabbi Eliezer. And there is dam even without basar. If there's dam without basar, then we understand our Mishnah that we could makriv all these karbanos b'tzibur in a state of tumah, and that can be reconciled with Rabbi Yossi. Maskifla Rav Mori nehi nami to Rabbi Yossi savak Rabbi Eliezer, that even in the absence of basar, you still have dam. We still can't work out our Mishnah with Rabbi Yossi. Why? Bishlema zvachim. Okay, part of the Mishnah you could reconcile with Rabbi Yossi. That's in the case of zevach, of behemoths that are slaughtered as a carbon. And those behemoths, those zvachim will come b'tumah, will bring them even b'tumah, even according to Rabbi Yossi, even though einat tzitz maratz ala ochlin, because yesh basar. I'm sorry, yesh dam below basar. And why in Zvachim do we have no problem whatsoever in reconciling the Mishnah with Rabbi Yossi who holds einat tzitz maratz al cholim mishum deika dam? Because the dam is subject to ritzui tzitz. So now the dam goes up to the mizbeach, and you can be makriv the carbon b'tum. But ha'omer, what are you going to do with minchas ha'omer that the Mishnah says is kreva b'tumah? Nami ika. There's also a chelik that's ola ala mizbeach, and it sits as maratza. And what is that? That's called a kometz. So if you recall, we discussed earlier today that the omer is a mincha in which the Kohen takes the mincha and he's maktir the mincha on the mizbeach. So now we can understand that even in the case of minchas ha'omer, there is a part that's ola al gabi mizbeach, and therefore we can go ahead and do the kmitza. Lechem aponim, nami ika bazichin. We take the bazichin levona that are placed on the shulchan with the lechem, and we be makir on the mizbeach. So in all these cases, we have a carbon that can be brought bituma. So we have, in the case of Minchas HaOmer, the carbon could be brought bituma, and in the case of Lechem HaPanim, because of the Bazichim, Ella Shtei Alechem. What's Shtei Alechem? Shtei Alechem, I mean, other than the Tnufa, has no other avoda. Is Ma'ikil Meimar. How can you explain that according to Rabbi Yossi, when there's no chelik that's brought on the Mizbeach, everything is eaten by the Kohanim, we said a split between the Kohen Gadol, etc., is if Rabbi Yossi holds that Einat Tzitz Meratz al Achilos, then Einat Tzitz Meratz Aleim Ketzad Nita Lakrima B'Tuma. How can you bring the Shtei Alechem B'Tuma? You don't have the tzitz to be Meratza. In the case of Dam, Avodas Dam, the tzitz is Meratza on the Dam, even though the Dam is Tomei. But here in Shtei Alechem, there is no Dam. So again, the Ritzi tzitz is for the benefit, so to speak, of the Mizbeach. But the Lechem, the Shtei Alechem of Shchag HaShavuos is not connected to the Mizbeach. The Chitem, maybe you'll tell me that what the Mishnah means when it says Shtei Alechem is brought B'Tumah, it doesn't mean the Shtei Alechem themselves. There's no Akrova in the Shtei Alechem. But rather it's referring to the Kivsei Atzeres, the Kivsei Shlomim, and that's called in the Lashon HaShas Li Karev, La Karev Imahen. So if I understand correctly, the Gemara is now in Shtei Alechem reinterpreting the Mishnah. The Gemara thought that Shtei Alechem means Shtei Alechem. And if the Mizbeach is getting nothing, then how could it be brought B'Tumah? There's no Tzitz Meratza. And now the Gemara is reinterpreting, no. What the Mishnah has in mind is when the Shtei Alechem are coming together, accompanied by the Kvasim, right, those two Kvasim, and now you shech the Kvasim, and you sanctify, you do a Kiddush on the Lechem, it's similar to Karban Toda, if you recall. So the Zrikas Hadam of the Kvasim is Matir the Lechem B'Achila. And therefore we can be Makriv B'Tumah, even according to Rabbi Yossi, because the tzitz is meratz on the dam of the kvasim. Nobody questions that tzitz is meratz on the dam. But the question is, when the Mishnah says you can bring the Shtei Alechem B'Tumah, what does that mean? What are you offering on the Mizbeach? Absolutely nothing. So where's the Ritzi tzitz that we need in the case of Shtei Alechem? And the Gemara answers, since the dam of the Shnei Kvasim, through its Zrika, is Makadish the Shtei Alechem, therefore, even if I hold that Einat Tzitz Meratz al Necholim, but the Tzitz is Meratz al Adam, so the dam of the Shnei Kvasim, which through its Zrika is Makadish the Shtei Alechem, is a valid Zrikas Adam, because the Tzitz is Meratza on dam. And that doesn't contradict Rabbi Yossi, who says Einat Tzitz Meratz al Necholim, because now we're not talking about Necholim, we're talking about the dam. The Gemara rejects this. Ainu Shalmei Tzibur. We have in the Mishnah Shtei Hakvasim, the Shnei Hakvasim is mentioned in the Mishnah in addition to Shtei Alechem as a separate category. And that's called Shalmei Tzibur. Right? Let's go back to the Mishnah, right? The Mishnah says that there are 5 karbanos that are brought bituma. So let's count to 5. Where am I? Ein Vav base. Yeah. He's got Omer, Shtei Alechem, Lechem upon him, and he's got Zivche Shalmei Tzibur. Now you're telling me that Shtei Alechem is a reference to the Shnei Kvasim. Those are the Shalmei Tzibur. Im Kain, Havile Arba, Vanan Chamisha Tanan. So it couldn't be that Shtei Alechem means that the Shtei Alechem is being accompanied by the Shnei Kvasim, the Shalmei Atzeres, because the Shalmei Atzeres are mentioned here as Shalmei Tzibur. So it must mean that the Shtei Alechem is Boim Bifnei Atzman. And once again, how do we work that out with Rabbi Yossi? Because Einat Tzitz Meratzal Nechalin. So you've got Tumah, and you have no Ritzi Tzitz. And again, all this is based on, if you remember, whether it was yesterday or the day before, and everything's a cloud in my mind, when we discussed Tumah Dechuya B'tzibur. And we were assuming that we must have the tzitz to be maratza, because otherwise you bring a carbon b'tumah, and it's also to bring a carbon b'tumah. The Torah is not saying that because the tzibur is tameh, that therefore there's no issue of bringing the carbon b'tumah. There is an issue of bringing carbon b'tumah, and we're going to activate the principle of dechuya, but dechuya requires a ritzi tzitz. Now, according to Rabbi Yossi, there is no ritzi tzitz in the Shtei Alechem, insofar as there's nothing going on in the Mizbeach, and the Ritzi Tzitz is for the benefit of the Mizbeach. If there's no Ritzi Tzitz, then Tumah Dechuya B'tzibur, and there's no way we could bring the Shtei Alechem and Shtei Atzma. Ella says the Gemara, Kasav Rabbi Yossi, Tumah Hutra B'tzibur. Until now, the Gemara was very, very hesitant to recognize any other Tanoim. There was only Rabbi Yehuda, if you remember, but all the other Tanoim, Peh Echad, and certainly Rabbi Yossi, we paskin always like Rabbi Yossi, held that Tumah Dechuya B'tzibur, hence we need the tzitz to be Maratza. Now the Gemara is departing from that premise and identifying Rabbi Yossi together with Rabbi Yehuda as the Shita that Tumah Hutra B'tzibur. If Tumah Hutra B'tzibur, we don't care about the Tumah. The Tumah is irrelevant. And it doesn't in any way interfere with our Krovas HaKarba. We don't need the tzitz to be Maratza. In Mela, we could be Makriv the Karba B'tzibur, even the Shtei Alechem, because we're holding Hutra B'tzibur. Okay, Rabbi, so we didn't finish exactly to the end line because I went through the Mishnah, but I think it was Kedai. I hope you don't mind. At least I felt I needed that background. You know, in Kodshim, you need constant chazara. So I'll take this opportunity to wish you all a great Shabbos. And thank you so much for a wonderful week and very productive.